First of all, I would like to ask you, why is John Constable so important for UK, and why is it important for the development of painting in general in his century? So who would like to start first? Is it Emily or Katharine? Emily? Thank you.
Thank you. Constable was a really innovative artist, and he had a very strong artistic vision. He had a very laborious working process. He made numerous drawings and studies and sketches, sometime at a very large scale for his painting. And he was part of a period in British art where the status of landscape painting was becoming more important. And he, like the painting behind us, wanted to show that landscape could stand on its own in its own right. He wasn't really part of the artistic establishment for much of his career, and he did eventually get there, but he's such a fascinating character as a person, as an artist. And as you mentioned, we have a collection of almost 400 objects by John Constable at the V&A, so we get a full span of his working process, and so it's been wonderful for us to pull together those highlights from the collection here. So his importance as an artist within British art is really important, but he also had quite a strong European following, and when he exhibited in France in 1824, he was met with huge acclaim. People were really interested in what he was doing. So there's this sort of European history to Constable's work as well, which we sort of tried to touch on here too.
You mentioned France. Was he a collectible artist during his life? Because if you go in our safari and you read the text, you will see that you made sure you have some quotes from the era where he's heavily criticized because of his very daring way of painting. Because he was so daring, was he collectible? I mean, people wanted to have a constable in their homes. Katharine?
I mean, I'm afraid to say the answer to that is that no, he wasn't terribly collectible. Certainly in Britain, most of his works remained unsold in his studio upon his death. However, he was supported by friends and mentors who could see that there was somebody brilliant in their midst, and so they did acquire people like Archdeacon Fisher, Sir George Beaumont. He was collected in Paris. He won, as Emily said, in the mid-1820s, a gold medal that was bestowed upon him by the King of France. And he did have two agents who sold paintings for him in Paris. So he did fairly well, actually, in France. And so the Louvre, to this day, has a really quite fabulous collection of his portraits. That collection was begun in the 19th century. But it is a shame that, yes, people didn't quite support him in the way that he should have been done during his lifetime.
Because usually we see this with contemporary art. We exhibit great artists and they are not being sold. And I was wondering if this was happening back in the days, and you just brilliantly answered the question that yes. He had agents in France, but did he have a representative in UK?
Quite often collectors would buy directly from the exhibition, or would build a relationship with an artist. So in the exhibition, we've included Leaping Horse, which is one of his largest and most important works. It was from a series devoted to the River Stour in Suffolk, where he was from. And these were known in his 6-footers because they were 6 feet wide, so almost 2 meters wide. And part of that was to draw attention to his art in this big exhibition where paintings were displayed side by side. So he just decided to go big to be, more visible and more visible to collectors. He did sell some of these scenes, but Leaping Horse remained unsold in the exhibition. But that was a very key and important way where artists could sell their work.
Leaping Horse, because you mentioned it, it's one of the most important works because of the size. He had this idea to have a sketch real size, and that was really amazing. And it's on permanent display in V&A. And right now it's over here in Art Safari. Wasn't it difficult to let it go? Because it's not like breaking the entire display in V&A, not having this over there. Because when we got it, we were deeply surprised and humbled to have it here in Art Safari because it's such a major piece signed by Constable.
I mean, when Emily and I were talking about this show, we felt very strongly, as did the painting section at the V&A, that if you're going to send out the best of Constable, then it does have to be the best. And we have 2 full-size sketches, one of which is the Hay Wain and one of which is Sleeping Horse. So we were emphatic about wanting to bring one of those here. And because it is such an important part of his working process and, as Emily said, became a really important way of attracting attention in exhibition spaces. So it was clear right from the start that that was on the schedule.
Can I add to that as well? I think also the V&A likes to lend, likes to share the work. We've got a huge collection and a really strong collection of landscape paintings, and it's sort of built into the DNA of the V&A that it's important to, share what's there, both in the UK and internationally. And so I think people want to say yes to things and they want things to go, and that was really important. And one of the reasons that we're very fortunate at the V&A is because we have such a huge collection of Constable. If we lend things, we've still got things here. So we can take over 80 objects like we have here, and there's still more to have for our visitors at the V&A. So yes, as Katharine said, bringing out some of the best things was very important to us to sort of celebrate Constable in a new context.
If we go around and see the artwork, we see a lot of nature, and we see sky and rivers, and Constable is kind of bringing the soul of the long walks that the Brits are having and their close relationship with nature in general. But if you carefully look, you'll still see some characters hidden kind of behind the trees, and especially you notice the presence of red. So what was his connection with people inside his landscapes? Katharine or Emily?
That's a very good question. Clearly, as a landscape artist, that was the main focus, but he was so close to the agricultural community. He was a part of it. His father was a mill owner and a trader in corn and iron, and so they were firmly embedded within that agrarian community. And so he wanted to show the rhythms of that agrarian life and the human content that was at the heart of it. So paintings like boat building, which, as we've seen, shows you how to build a boat and all those labourers involved in that work. And also when he moved further afield and he went to Hampstead, just outside of London, again somewhere like Branch Hill Pond, he is showing the sort of activity that's taking place in these environments. So he was very attentive, you're absolutely right, to the human content of a scene, which I think also allowed him to give additional interest as well. Emily, do you want to?
I think also there are moments where he's inserting figures, and you mentioned also those touches of red as a sort of artistic device. So in this room we have a drawing of a very large tree, and just next to it he's inserted a very small figure, which gives a sense of scale. When you're looking at drawings, which are generally a little bit smaller, inserting a figure shows how enormous something could be. So he could use it as an artistic device like that. And you mentioned these sort of characteristic touches that he had in his use of red in particular. And quite often in some of his paintings, you'll see that he'll be adding touches of red throughout the composition, and he's bringing it together, he's uniting it, and highlighting particular details. So while he is being very sensitive and attentive to the sort of rhythms of rural life, to the fall of light through trees, the movement of clouds. He's being very sort of careful and precise about how he's building these compositions and how he can use figure and touches of colour to unite the composition into a sort of pleasing whole.
We are very close to 3 amazing Turner pieces, which are in the other room. How did he influence Turner? One of the most important artists in UK.
Turner and Constable are quite often seen side by side. They were both experimental and innovative in very different ways. Turner, quite often in landscape painting, would include sort of grand moments of history in a way that Constable didn't. And Turner, again, is a sort of fabulous painter, particularly his use of light is something that he's really admired for. And Constable sort of both admired Turner, but also wasn't always his biggest fan. And it's just what we've tried to do by bringing in the Turners is to think about that relationship and the struggle of identifying yourself alongside a very big name in the contemporary art world. And it's interesting to see how they're approaching the same scenes, the same places. So even though Constable mostly painted at home, he visited Salisbury, which is a town in Wiltshire, in the west of England, because his best friend lived there. But it was also somewhere where Turner went. And so we've tried to include objects that show how they're approaching the same scene, the same artistic problem, and to bring in a sense of what Constable felt about him and that mixture of kind of admiration and almost disdain. I don't know. I think it's interesting to bring it together. And the other artists that we've brought in of Constable's contemporaries and sort of recent British predecessors, we've done the same thing, because everyone's watching each other. These exhibitions, these artists are being shown side by side, so that comparison was quite an important feature of all of their careers.
We mentioned before that if he was collectible, was he a collector? Could he afford the artworks, and what kind of art he preferred in his collection?
That's a very good question, and actually speaks to one of the themes of this exhibition, because he was inspired by his own contemporaries and recent predecessors, as Emily's just mentioned. And so he did acquire certain works by his contemporaries, certainly by Gainsborough, by Richard Wilson, for example. But he also looked to old masters from the 17th and 18th centuries. And that was possibly a bit beyond his pocket financially. But in order to acquire them, he acquired prints by them. Because, as of course you know, Rubens, prints after Rubens were phenomenal. Rembrandt was a fantastic printmaker himself, and so Constable bought some really choice impressions by Rembrandt, And also one of his favourites was the printmaker and painter Claude Lorraine, and he lovingly assembled most of his prints throughout his lifetime. So yes, his collection was really impressive in terms of his printmaking, running into the thousands.
In the last room of Constable exhibition here at our safari, you carefully installed Constable next to David Lucas. Could you please talk a little bit about the mezzotintas next to the oils sketches?
And then you go. Yes, this is, as you say, in the last section, and we wanted to feature this as a part of the exhibition quite strongly, because it was this collaboration with David Lucas, which took place in the last decade of his life, which became so important for him. He was actually very bereaved. He just lost his beloved wife, Maria, in November 1828, and he'd taken on their 7 children and became sole parent to all of them. They were very little. However, he had this indomitable spirit, did John Constable, and he decided to embark upon this huge printmaking venture to create a series of prints after 22 works that he created throughout his life. And it really gave him an opportunity to revisit these works and these certain pictorial ideas within them, and to sort of push them to a limit in mezzotint. And mezzotint was an intaglio print making technique that emerged in the 17th century, and the British seemed to excel upon it, so much so that it became known as the manière anglaise. And it was a tonal technique, so you could actually reproduce paintings and also give a sense of the brush strokes even loaded with paint. And he found this little known printmaker called Lucas, who was a complete novice, but he became a master under Constable's supervision. And Constable just really wanted to try and push that element of light and dark, or chiaroscuro, in his own works. That's what he became fascinated by, and that's what he focused on really in this print series. Is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, so alongside this series of prints, which we've displayed alongside the oil sketches and paintings that inspired them, we've included another 4 objects, all of which he made at the end of his life. And our idea is that this creative project, which was a complete commercial failure, did spur on his own creativity right up until the end of his life. So we've chosen some of our favourite works from the collection that speak to that sort of experimentation. So we have included, the last object in the show is a watercolor of Stonehenge. This is a prehistoric monument, sort of stone, well, monument's probably not quite the right word, but sort of stone structure in Wiltshire, which is again near Salisbury, where his great friend Archdeacon Fisher lived. And it's the most virtuoso performance. It's so confident and bold in how it's captured the sky, the double rainbow, these ancient stones propped up against one another. And so we're showing that even though he didn't have commercial success with this print series, that process of working with someone else, learning more about a different medium, caused him to continue to experiment and be creative in what he was doing right up until the end of his life.
You mentioned that he liked to experiment, and I was here yesterday for your tour, and I will be here tonight for the night tour because you are also going to host one. And you mentioned yesterday the experimentation that he did from moving to impasto to a lighter color, use of color to depict the sky and to depict the rain. Could you tell us more, please, Katharine, about that specific painting that I'm referring to?
Yes, that's Branch Hill Pond, and he became very interested in that particular part of Hampstead. Hampstead was this village to the north of London, and Constable started to stay there on a yearly basis for his wife Maria's health, but also because Constable, because it was so it was quite gentle in terms of its hills, actually, but it offered this viewing platform. So he could observe the clouds and all that sort of meteorological phenomena that he was fascinated by. And I think what I was very struck by when I looked at his 1829 version of Branch Hill Pond, which is completely stunning, is that part of the clouds on the right-hand side, he's obviously applied the paint so thinly, and you can see the weave of the canvas. So you do get this sort of atmosphere, or almost this sort of nebulous structure that he's created. And then beneath it, the sandy bank is thick with impasto, and you can see him sort of trailing his palette knife through, and he's building up the paint layers there in a deliberate way to convey the sort of structure of this sandy bank on the right, if you like. So that's really worth a close look, I think.
Here in our safari for the Constable exhibition, you brought some Gainsborough. And I know that Gainsborough was not using paint on the white canvas. He was using a darker layer of a brown color. Was Constable doing the same? He was applying paint straight on white, or he preferred to paint the entire canvas with a different color to obtain this very misty British meteorological atmosphere?
I think this is one of the ways that he was experimenting, and it varies hugely, particularly when looking at his works on paper versus what he's doing on canvas. But certainly, I mean, to sort of relate back to what you were saying about Branch Hill Pond, we've included cloud study, which is oil on paper, but he treats it almost like watercolor. So he covered the entire sheet with blue, and this was quite unusual. He didn't do this very often. So he'd cover the entire sheet with blue oil paint, very thinly, and then he'd add splodges of white paint to create the more bulbous bits of the clouds, and then add a very diluted white oil paints to run his brush across to create these wisps of cloud. So that's an example where it's a sort of blue background, and there are examples where he's using more of a mid-tone too. So it really depended on the medium, the atmosphere that he wanted to create, and how those layers of paint would create whatever atmosphere or effect that he was particularly seeking in that painting.
We are surrounded here by a very amazing wallpaper, and it's actually from your collection. We got the permission to reproduce this beautiful Victorian wallpaper, just to introduce our audience a little bit more in the homes of that time. How was the Victorian atmosphere in the houses when Constable was alive?
Quite busy, as the wallpaper indicates, and it was exciting for us. We've got a huge collection of historic wallpaper dating back hundreds of years at the V&A, and so it was exciting to sort of look through what we had to send over a few ideas to your team, who've so beautifully recreated it here. It's nice because this was originally just a scrap, a few inches wide of paper. So to see it here as it would have originally looked is really exciting for us. So Victorian homes, I guess, yeah, busy, decorative, a lot on the walls. I mean, now when we look through the exhibition here, all of the paintings are given room to breathe. They're not all crammed together. Things were much more densely packed in Victorian homes. So it's nice here to give a bit of an indication, as you say, of that period, because things are hung here in a very contemporary way. It's nice to give a little bit of a sense of that Victorian home atmosphere with this wallpaper.
So if the Victorians were not buying Constable from the exhibition, who are they buying?
You talked about that. Yeah.
So the V&A's collection of paintings was formed in 1857 with a large gift to contemporary British painting by John Sheepshanks. He was particularly interested in the works that were being produced at that time, and he would collect sometimes directly from the artists. So we have people like Mulready, Redgrave, Turner, Constable, some of the biggest names, Landseer. He was particularly interested in genre scenes, sometimes paintings with a theatrical past to them. There was often quite a literary side to his interest in oil paintings, and that was very typical of the period. So in the Sheepshanks gallery that we have at the V&A, which is hung on a dark red wall, which is a very Victorian colour, and in a smaller space that we have in the British galleries, we tried to give a sense of his interests, which were broadly reflective of the kind of thing that people were collecting at that time.
Katharine, why seeking truth?
Why seeking truth? Okay. That's the ultimate question, isn't it? And the reason for that is because that's what motivated Constable's life, was to seek the truth in all its forms. And he did actually say to a friend, I have been seeking the the truth at second hand. In fact, the quote is there on the wall, which is great. And he realised that what he meant by that is that he was looking to the work of his contemporaries, or of old master painters and printmakers, as we mentioned earlier on, and that he realised what he needed to do back is to just go to the subject matter, which were his own natural surroundings, and to look very closely and scrutinise them in a forensic way, which is exactly what he did. And he'd go out with his pocket sketchbook every day and make hundreds of sketches. These sketchbooks, we have 3 of them in V&A, and they are utterly phenomenal because you can see that he's sketching as he's thinking. And so we felt that that is really the crux of Constable's working practice. And that's why we called it Seeking Truth, the Art of John Constable.
And going backwards, actually, you divided the exhibition here at our safari in several chapters. Could you please describe the chapters? And also, I would like you to mention a little bit the other authors that are present here, because indeed we have big names like Dürer and Rembrandt. And of course, I already mentioned Gainsborough and Turner, which I completely adore.
So we decided with the exhibition to divide it into 4 themes, which we felt gave the best overview of Constable and his career and his working practice. And one of the things that really defines him as an artist is this reverence for the landscape that he grew up in. So the first theme of the exhibition is called A Sense of Place, and we focus particularly on a number of drawings and watercolours, oil sketches and finished paintings of this landscape in East Bergholt in Suffolk, this small corner of England. And it's not a particularly remarkable landscape. There aren't any great mountains or sort of dramatic features, but it was what he knew. And as Katharine said earlier on, he was the son of a mill owner. He knew that landscape, he understood how it worked. And so lots of the objects we've chosen reveal that very knowledgeable side to Constable. He understood what particular plough was being used, or how a particular Suffolk barge pony could leap over barriers on towpaths. He really understood that landscape. So we focus on that and start to sort of introduce him as both a man and an artist in that section of the exhibition. The second theme is on inspiration, and that's where we look at his fascination with old master painters, and that's where we have the prints by Rubens and Rembrandt and Dürer, and we've tried to pair those with some of his paintings and drawings too, so that you can see how that inspiration was taking shape in his own work. And then we also look at his contemporaries. So we've mentioned Gainsborough, Richard Wilson, Turner, Thomas Girton, a fantastic watercolourist in particular, who died at only 27. And both Turner and Constable said if he'd lived, we would have had very different careers because he was such a talent. So it's been wonderful to bring those two. So those are the first 2 sections, and Katharine.
Okay. Yes, and then the third section is close observation, because, as I've just mentioned, he was given to this really careful examination of his surroundings, whether it was leaves on trees, or whether it was the actual sort of river itself, or indeed the whole of a sort of panoply of clouds and meteorological phenomena above him, whether it's cirrus clouds or cumulus clouds. So again, we felt that that was a very important part of his working practice to foreground. And then the final theme is this collaboration with David Lucas, which, as Emily said, gave rise to such a creative last few years of his career in all media. It's so striking, actually, to see him working in such a rapid, powerful way, whether it's in watercolour or oil, or indeed with a pencil. He was phenomenal. So yes, we felt that just looking at his entire career, and also the nearly 400 works by John Constable that we do have at the V&A, we could distill it into those 4 themes.
I was really touched by the Girton pieces that we have here, and for me was a true discovery, because of course I knew it from albums, but to see it in here in real life in Bucharest, you kind of realize that he was 100 years ahead German Romanticism. And it's absolutely amazing to discover how he changed the European way of painting. And it's indeed, I think he was right that if he would have lived longer, the art history would have been totally different. Thank you so much for your time, and I can't wait to hear you tonight for the night tour that starts at 10. It was a privilege to hear you talking a little bit about Constable, and especially to have it here, right next to us, and we are surrounded by art history and one of the masters that really changed the way of the landscape painting over here in Romania as well, because Nicolae Grigorescu was influenced definitely by him. So thank you so much, Katharine, Emily, for doing this for the Romanian audience.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Great pleasure.